Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Pilots and flight attendants, what was the scariest thing to happen to you in flight? Serious. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The scariest experience I've had while flying would have to be when one of my instructors ordered a go-around maybe 5 feet above the runway for practice. Stupid me took out the flaps first and then put in power. Let's just say I'm surprised that the thing didn't slam into the ground. Took off at night. Right alternator light comes on right after takeoff. The aircraft instrument light starts flickering. My first officer is flying the plane. I tell him to continue as normal until we reach a safe altitude to run the checklist. As we're climbing through 500 feet, I see a bright shower of sparks from the right engine. Passengers start gasping and talking. My first officer kind of freezes up. I say, turn back. He starts to turn the airplane opposite direction of what we had briefed in case of an emergency situation. I say, I have the controls, and take over, and turn us on a right downward. I tell him to tell air traffic control we need to return immediately. I turn the alternator off, but the sparks are still flying. The engine is running fine though. We were only in the air for a couple of minutes, but the adrenaline was high for sure. Seeing sparks flying from the front of your engine is never a good thing. I was glad it was just the alternator though, because it didn't cause any power loss. Turns out, one of the mechanics that put the engine back together after an inspection forgot to tighten the alternator wire bundle down completely, resulting in loose wires contacting each other. Coming from the passenger perspective, anytime there are sparks flying out of any part of the airplane, especially the engine, we panic too. So great job being a professional and getting that plane on the ground safely. Thanks. Private pilot here. I only have about 110 hours so far, so I haven't had any near misses or anything regarding crashes, collisions yet, and hopefully I never will. However, I was taking my mother to breakfast at an airport about 55 miles from our home airport. This airport is uncontrolled, so I was making the appropriate self-announcing calls on the airport's frequency and was scanning for traffic as well as I could. This airport shares a radio frequency with about 3 or 4 other airports. So when you make your call, it's important to note at the beginning and end which airport you're addressing. With no one in sight, I enter the pattern to set up to land. As I'm about to turn left base, I announce it on my radio. Immediately after the announcement, some guy yells into his radio, "Look out, look out!" My heart drops as I immediately think I somehow missed spotting some other traffic who perhaps wasn't using their radio, and that we were going to collide. Turns out there were skydivers being released at one of the other airports on the frequency. The pilot who made the call, this clear after the lookout part, but for about a second I was thinking, oh shit, because he didn't make it clear that he was at a different airport. My mom and I did get a laugh out of it afterwards, although she was also terrified when it happened. TLDR. Skydiver pilot at a different airport makes loud, unexpected announcement starting with "Look out, look out," right after one of my radio calls on the same frequency at an uncontrolled airport, which made my mom and I think we were at risk of a collision with another plane. I was flying with a student on a nice clear day. We were doing ground reference maneuvers, flying fairly close to the ground and snaking over roads, etc. I was pretty pleased with my student's execution of the maneuvers when out of the corner of my eye I saw movement above the tree line. On second glance, it turned out to be a mother effing stunt plane flying directly into our path. I punched the throttle, pulled the yoke back and climbed out of there like a homesick angel. I checked the multifunction display, moving map, and there was no indication of another airplane with his transponder on. There were no radio calls to the area. Fine, I thought. He doesn't have to do any of those despite the fact that they are the smart thing to do. And then this asshole starts shadowing us really, really closely. I couldn't descend to redo the maneuver for fear of getting too close to this hot dog. I'm a flight attendant on a small 50-passenger planes, CRJ 100s and 200s. When there was about 40 minutes left in the flight, I get a call from the flight deck that they have an indicator reading that my passenger door is not locked. So I double-checked the physical deadbolt indicators on the door, and 2 of the 8 indicators were a little misaligned. So to be safe, I stopped service and sat down for the rest of the flight directly next to the door, praying that it was an issue with the indicator up in the flight deck. I'm sure that my face was flushed for a little bit. For the rest of the 40-minute flight, I was cracking down on every person that attempted to stand up and every seatbelt that I heard being undone. I didn't want any unlucky person being sucked out of the door if it happened to suddenly fly open. People started getting annoyed and starting asking questions why the seatbelt sign had been on for so long, and I just told them that the pilots think there might be some major turbulence soon. Thankfully, all was well and we landed with no issue. A few people getting off the plane were telling me how terrible the experience was and how badly they had to go to the bathroom, and I wouldn't let them. If only they knew. C'est la vie. This is why I love posts like this. You have what seems like a completely innocuous situation which could have been a potential emergency, and the passenger would just see it as a gross inconvenience and be angry. But you kept your professionalism and kept everyone safe, so great job. Thanks for what you do in an often thankless job. We almost crashed coming into O'Hare. The co-pilot was pretty inexperienced and tried to touch down during an insanely fast-moving crosswind. He should have circled around again. I was seated in the back of the plane, CRJ 900. Both passengers next to me had a death grip on my hand or knee. Was covered in bruises. I've never seen a pilot so pissed off. He was cussing out the co-pilot the whole way to the hotel. I was a flight attendant for 3 years, back in the late 2000s for Northwest Airlines, now merged with Delta Airlines. I will never forget my last flight from Minneapolis to Detroit in October 2009. For starters, we had a self-proclaimed psychic on board who informed everyone that this plane is going to crash and we're all going to effing die by screaming it at the top of her lungs as soon as we reached cruising altitude. We ended up having to move her to a private section of the plane to try to calm her down and ease the minds of the panicked passengers. Sure enough, we hit extreme unreported turbulence as soon as beverages were passed out. Drinks were flying through the air, luggage hit a few of the overhead bins open, and people were screaming and terrified, mostly due to the psychic in my opinion. A couple other flight attendants couldn't help but cry. It was a horrible scene. After an eternity, we reached Detroit. Of course, the runways were iced over, and we slid nearly sideways after touching down. Again, everyone was screaming. I'm honestly surprised the plane didn't flip over. When we landed, everyone let out a roar of applause. Airport security boarded the plane and detained the psychic. I was so shaken up that I quit as soon as we unloaded. The experience was so awful that the passengers and crew members all received a flight voucher. The crew got a check for the same value. I think it was worth about $350. I'm not an airline pilot, but I fly small planes as I build my hours to get to that point. Me and a co-pilot were hired to fly a Cessna across the country. We stopped for fuel, and on takeoff, we got to only about 100 feet when the plane stopped climbing, then started doing the exact opposite of that. We turned and lined up for a different runway, but we were still coming down very hard and very fast. The plane hit the runway, and then went off the side into the dirt and stopped only 70 feet from where it first hit the ground, which isn't much considering we were going at highway speeds. I broke 8 bones in my body, including 3 vertebrae, and was in the hospital for about 3 months as well. But despite this, I still want to get back in the plane and fly again though. A couple years back, I was flying an instrument approach down to Melbourne, Florida. I forget the name of the approach exactly, but we were supposed to circle the 09R. Coming down ATC hits us up about a storm cell that's making its way to the field and asks if we still want to continue the approach. Anyone familiar with Florida in the summer knows these types of storms aren't exactly rare. SIC and I figure we can beat it in. We could see it painted on our radar, so we continue. About 600 feet above minimums, it has become very clear that it's moving faster than both we and the ATC thought. Not 5 seconds later, ATC hits us up again to tell us just this and mentions the winds have flipped. We asked if we can just circle to 27L instead, which he approves. We get in the thick of it and barely broke out of the clouds above minimums before touching down into a wall of rain after battling some of the craziest winds I've flown in to date. Palms were definitely sweaty after that one. I was getting my glider pilot license, and one of the pilots in training went on his first solo flight at the end of the day. It was the last flight of the day, so the rest of us were watching his approach, and we all saw his glider suddenly disappear under the trees of the forest that's right behind the runway. We were told to go back to the dorms while the people in charge went to investigate the crash. The guy who crashed walked into our dorm a couple of hours later completely fine. He got really lucky to leave that situation completely unharmed. I've heard of cases where people crash into forests and get impaled by branches. I'm still a student pilot working towards my private pilot's license. One of the requirements towards your PPL is a cross-country solo. I made mine from KAPA to KPUB to KLHX. Being in Colorado, we can get bad winds and updraft over the plains, causing turbulence. My first leg to Pueblo was fine, except making myself look like a jackass on frequency, and the leg to La Junta was okay. I decided to stop there to use the bathroom and stretch. With my luck, the starter on the 172 I was renting failed when trying to start the engine. After waiting for the mechanic to fly down and fix it, I was on my way about 4 hours later. The wind at the airport was barely below the minimum I was allowed to take off in, so I decided to fly myself back. That flight was the longest, most turbulent flight I will probably ever have. I was hitting my head on the roof of the plane, banking like crazy and getting really sick. I was outside the range of flight following, so I could do nearly nothing. Getting back to my home airport, I've never been that happy to land. TLDR. Plane broke, making me fly home later than I wanted, causing bad turbulence. I am a captain for a major US airline. Several years ago, when I was still a first officer, I was working a flight in Manchester, New Hampshire during a nasty winter storm. It was my leg to fly, and the ATIS was reporting the weather to be wind variable at 40 knots, gusting to 60 knots, visibility 1 mile in sleet and freezing rain with a ceiling of 800 feet overcast. LLWS advisories in effect, and braking action fair to poor on a slushy runway. The ceiling and viz were no big deal for airplane flying, but it was enough wind to get our attention. The ride was continuously moderate turbulence below 10,000 feet as we were vectored for the ILS. I'm fighting the gusts to stay on adjusted ref speeds when, shortly after passing the outer marker and fully configured for landing, we get a warning for a decreasing performance wind shear ahead. I immediately execute the wind shear escape procedure we train for every year, applying full power and momentarily pitching the nose up to the flight director, which is now in wind shear guidance mode. I feel a momentary increase in climb performance, followed almost immediately by a nearly instantaneous 35 to 40 knot loss in airspeed. I dump the nose over as the pitch limit indicator now appears on my altitude indicator and moves below the flight director warning that the angle of attack is approaching a stall. I hear the GPWS automated voice announce 1,000, telling me the plane has descended past 1,000 feet above the ground. At that point, the captain, who was the pilot not flying, begins to call out the vertical speed of the aircraft per company procedure, 1,200 feet per minute down. Every time, the aircraft's automatic voice called out the altitude as it continued to decrease, 900, 1,000 down, 800, 1,000 down, 700. We're at maximum thrust, and the aircraft was still descending, with ground contact imminent. Procedure called for pitching up into the PLI and riding the stick shaker stall. I held that pitch attitude until the aircraft stopped descending. We got down to the 200 foot above the ground call on the ground proximity warning system before the descent stopped, and we slowly began to climb, all while riding one hell of a roller coaster. I never saw the ground, nor did I ever hear the autopilot disconnect siren blaring due to sensory exclusion in my brain. I was focused entirely on my pitch and VSI. After we were clear of the wind shear, we completed the rest of the missed approach procedure and entered a hold to give the weather some time to improve. About 30 minutes later, we were able to make a successful landing at MHT. I've landed in a tropical storm. I have had engine failures and fires, but that time, more than any other, scared the shot out of me. I had to take a walk around the terminal in Manchester for 20 minutes or so to get my legs to stop shaking. You know that line in the movie Billy Madison where he's like, "I understand 5 words in that book now." That's how I felt reading this post. I didn't understand a lot of the technical jargon. I tried my best, but thank you for sharing a hair-raising experience. Great job getting the plane down. Thank you. Just a GA pilot, but here's what I've got. I have a couple hundred hours, so I'm not a total buffoon. and I'm based out of a small airport in Maryland where the end of the runway is literally next to a major highway, WOO. So, one time, I was taking my friend up with me. One of them has horrible fear of flying, but I convinced her it's fine, just a day trip to the beach. Everything was looking good, little gusty, clear skies, the works. Anyways, so when a 172 SP loaded, I'd rotate around 60 to 65 just in case. About 25 feet off the ground, we're hit with an intermittent wind shear, a big one. For those wondering, a wind shear is an unexpected, basically mega gust of wind. This shear caused my nose to skyrocket upwards, airspeed was dropping to 40, stall horns blaring, and we were over the highway. I take the full force of the body and push the yoke as hard as I can inward to try and put the nose down. Luckily, we recovered with about 75 feet of clearance before plowing into oncoming car traffic. My friend still brings it up, although I'm going off of AF to become a pilot. She's still hesitant to fly again, even though it was a freak accident. My dad was a certified commercial pilot, but was not working as such at the time. Post-Vietnam had a lot of pilots and he couldn't find a job. When I was 6, we flew from Orlando to Miami on Christmas Eve during the day to visit my grandparents in a 4-seater. My mom was heavily pregnant with my brother. I was in the back and had my seatbelt off, never again. We hit some sort of air pocket, and the next thing I know, my head is on the ceiling and the plane is spiraling towards the ground. It happened so fast. From my perspective, the ground was spiraling up at me. My mom and I were screaming. My dad somehow pulled us out of it at 500 feet or so before we hit the ground. My mom's drink was spilled all over her pretty dress. I remember that well. Obviously, this put a damper on my whole plan to look for Santa's sleigh in the sky, but we had to fly back that night and somehow my mom made me excited to look for him again. But yeah, the whole family was nearly wiped out on Christmas Eve.